So welcome. This is the Harriman Institute's discussion of the coming Georgian election. I want to thank the Harriman Institute for putting this together. Thank our panelists for joining us, and all of you for joining us on Zoom and on YouTube from wherever you are. Just briefly, before we turn to the substance, I wanted to just go over some logistical things about how the panel will work. First, I want to apologize in advance because of some COVID-related reasons. I have to have all my windows open. I'm in Manhattan, which means there is inevitably construction noise in the background. It's not in the spring, there were inevitably ambulances, but we seem to have, at least for now, gotten past that. So please just forgive me for that. I'll try to mute myself as necessary. I'm going to very briefly introduce the panel now, and my reason for doing this very briefly is that you all have seen the flyer for the event, so you have some sense of who's on the panel. We do have a very good panel with some very accomplished people, but you don't want to waste your time reading their bios. And also, whenever I'm on a panel and someone's reading my bio, they always get something slightly wrong or phrase something slightly weird, and then I get upset and thrown off my game. So let me just do that very quickly in order of the people on our screen. We have Michael CECIRE, who is an old friend, longtime Georgia watcher, somebody I've written with, worked with, and kibitzed with about Georgian politics for a very long time. And you can find out more about him online at the Institute or through just do a search on him. Laura Lindemann is someone I've kibitzed with about Georgia a little bit less, but has been writing and thinking and speaking about Georgia for a very long time. So we're very grateful to have her on the panel. Alex Scrivener, I've really just met through this panel, so I look forward to years of, I'll change the language, kvetching about Georgia going into the future. And so we're very happy to have you. And Anna Dolidze will be joining us very soon. She texted me shortly and said she's on her way. She is not just a longtime scholar, a very accomplished scholar of Georgia, very active in the NGO sector, but she's currently a candidate. So she is actually out campaigning. So she will be back soon. And then so we will incorporate her into the discussion. For the format of this, we're going to have 3 rounds, and each question, I'm going to give each of the panelists about 3 minutes. And I'm going to be reasonably strict about that. If Anna and or Laura go over, I'm just going to say politely, it's time to stop talking. And if Michael or Alex go over, I'm going to put this mask on. It says, "Will you shut up, man?" It's from the debate. It's one of my. I've decided that which candidate I'm supporting in the election here in the United States. Before we get started, I'm just going to make some very introductory comments because you really came to hear the panelists, not me. But this is the 2020 parliamentary election in Georgia. Georgia's elections have recently fallen pretty similarly to the American presidential election, which means that we have to make room in our minds for Trump and Biden because we're focused so much on Georgia. But one thing that strikes me is this is 8 years into the Georgian Dream's term. And one theme I want to just think about as we go forward today is regime cycles, the cycle of consolidation and collapse. If the timing from previous years tells us anything, it tells us that we should be paying some attention to where we are in that cycle. So I just want to flag that, not necessarily as a question, but just to think about for everybody. What strikes me as I read about this election from the United States is that this is the first Georgian election that is not being described as, at least from the outside, as seminally important, right? And I think that's a healthy sign. But I didn't want to flag that because it is almost intellectually like a lazy way out to just say this is the most important election ever. But we're not hearing that in Georgia. That seems to be interesting. And then I'm always struck by in any election anywhere, but particularly one like this, how much is new, how much is old? How much of this, what we're seeing in this election, have we just heard over and over, and what is genuinely new? And the last thing, which really has come up in the last couple of weeks, long after we started planning this, is the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, which could have implications throughout the region. So I'm going to begin. And the order for this question, we'll just start. The question is, and you can go wherever you want with this, that's the point, but I would like you to keep it to 3 minutes. So Laura, why don't you start? Why is this election important?
Thanks, Lincoln. And I just want to thank also the panelists and the Harriman Institute for having us. It's great to be talking about Georgian elections. And to your point, Lincoln, we've heard a little less about this being the most important election thus far. So it's great to have an opportunity to talk about it a little bit. I would say, okay, why is the election important? A couple things. As we know, the recent changes to the electoral law allow for what should hopefully be more parties potentially in parliament and a better distribution of parties in parliament. And so that means we'll have one of two outcomes: a continuation of Georgian Dream government and or a Georgian Dream coalition-led government in parliament, or a diverse coalition of parties in parliament. So either of those, I think we could talk about what that means, potentials for that, but one of those two outcomes is what we're going to see here. And so that in and of itself is sort of interesting. A more diverse parliament, what's going to happen, and we can talk about it. But I'd also like to point out the last election in 2018, round 2 of Zurabishvili's presidential election, was concerning as far as how free and fair the election was. I was an election observer myself. And so it is important, and I like to see that we haven't seen as much sort of vitriol hanging about thus far. It's early yet in the pre-election period, but these elections need to be a significant step forward, not a step back from what we've seen thus far. And obviously, platitudes, but it's important for Georgia to keep maintaining and moving forward their democratic credentials. With the war, they are in Nagorno-Karabakh, they are still a bright spot in the region, and they can continue to sort of move that forward with a really well-conducted election. So I'd really like to highlight that. And then just sort of looking forward, it's going to be a challenge for whatever new government we see form. The economic challenges and the security challenges are really severe. So we're going to have to sort of pay attention to that and not forget that it's not just about winning, it's about governing. So thank you.
Yeah, why don't we go to Alex? Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I completely agree with Laura in that one of the major things here is the electoral reform, which is going to lead to a more diverse parliament. And I'm old enough to remember the 1990s, where we had a parliament with lots of factions and sort of interesting characters. And sort of since the Rose Revolution, really, parliament hasn't been the center of the Georgian political gravity. A lot of politics happened outside of parliament because a lot of the main actors have been outside of parliament. Now, with this lower electoral barrier, we're going to see hopefully a diversity of political parties and actors that we haven't seen before in parliament. Like, you know, we're going to see Shalvan Atilashvili back in, you know, for the first time since the 1990s, almost certainly. Those sort of quite loud sort of figures, which may make parliament more of an arena than it has been in recent Georgian history, which I think will be interesting. That makes this election important. I mean, it's possible that Georgian Dream won't win a majority. I think even if it doesn't, it's likely to be able to govern more or less alone with kind of last minute conversions from other parties. So I don't think it's going to change much on that sort of measurement. But I think there's one really important thing, and I'm sorry I'm going to have to use the C word here, and that's the COVID factor. Now, this election is very important for many ordinary Georgians because, unfortunately, it's actually led potentially to a real upturn in COVID cases in Georgia. And if those of you don't know, I mean, Georgia had, and it's very rare you can say this about something in the Caucasus region, had a world-leading COVID response until about a month ago. Almost no COVID in the whole country. It was sort of in the ranks of New Zealand, Taiwan, as being somewhere where they've managed it very well, possibly the best in Europe. And at some point during the campaign, someone decided that actually the political cost of maintaining that policy would exceed the benefit. And suddenly the policy on COVID changed from locking down whole villages when there was one case. They sort of just let it go. And that might mean, in fact, that this electoral period may actually cost the lives of many Georgians, which I think is an interesting, well, it's worse than interesting, it's quite sad actually, upshot of this election. So I think it's probably my 3 minutes, but those are 2 points I think I would highlight.
Thank you. Before I turn to Michael, I'm really struck by something both of you said, and Michael, you don't have to answer this if you're going to go another way, but just maybe think about it or think about it for the next round, which is, Laura raised this point about governance, and of course campaigns and elections are about governance. So on the one hand, there's kind of two ways to think about governance. There's the battery of usual challenges, which are only getting worse: economic development, security, territorial integrity, being in the region where Georgia is located. But there's an additional governance challenge, which is true of any country in the world, particularly ones that are having elections now, which is that the world is going to look very, very different in February of 2021 than it did in February of 2020. And that may be a good thing in some respects, but it's going to be a bad thing in some other respects. So the challenges are really unique. Let me rephrase that with using proper English. Are really unusual. It can't be really unique. And it's going to be a different period. And I'm wondering if there's the capacity in any of the people and groups of parties contesting this election to really adjust to that. So, Michael, you don't have to answer that. I want you to answer the original question, which is, why is the election important? But
yeah, thank you. I mean, first, let me also thank the Harriman Institute and you, Lincoln, and my fellow panelists. I'm always very proud to be among such distinguished company. So I think I can answer your question and also the original question at once, at least in the way I've been thinking about it. And that what we seem to have is a situation where the world is changing very quickly, and developments are on a day-by-day basis, month-by-month, are shifting rapidly in such a manner that it's hard to really know, how to predict the future, and certainly how to use the past or the present as an extrapolation for what to think about in terms of policies or policy alternatives. So I think that's going to be difficult. And the way that graphs with this this election is the question of governance, I think, is going to be brought up in the sense of, well, which party and which group of politicians are going to be adept at being able to adapt to the circumstances and are going to be able to be in a position where, as things change, as developments shift rapidly, that they can that they'll be in a position to bring Georgia to a place that's better off than where they were before, or at least to manage crisis in a way that's reasonable. And I think Nagorno-Karabakh is actually a really great example of that. It's not necessarily COVID related, but it certainly is, I think, well exemplifies a dynamic in which this is the general Georgian approach to the conflict, which has been, I think, in many ways, the world's approach to the conflict, is basically to pray that things don't get too bad. And do what you can on the margins to sort of nudge things in a better direction, but ultimately the realization is that that agency is really on the ground between Azerbaijan and Armenia for the most part. And I think what we've seen is that sort of approach is really quite untenable and puts Georgia in particular in something of a terrible strategic and security bind, where not only do we have the propensity for a regional conflict, and a conflict that in some ways is already regionalized, but it also directly impacts Georgia's security. And you can see some very realistic scenarios where Georgia becomes a battleground between major powers being drawn into a conflict. And that's, I think, for Georgian voters, there has to be a thought in that, as it turns to COVID, but also about things like democratic development and economic development. With the world changing the way it is, climate change, with the world changing the way it is, who is going to be in the best position to be able to adapt to those things and react nimbly? And I think that's what makes this election important. But I think it also asks a lot of questions of the current political arena right now.
thank you, Michael. That was great. And I almost took my mask out. So we're very fortunate. Anna Dolidze has joined us. And we will be going to her in a second just to bring you up to speed. We're in the first round here of questions. And the question that we're discussing for 3 minutes each, and we're coming to you next, Anna, is why is this election important? So please.
Hello, everyone. Great to see you also from distance. Familiar faces. Great to meet whoever I don't know yet, I haven't met yet, and I'm happy to address the audience. I'm glad that there's some people attending and interested in the Caucasus. It's not that much on the radar in Western media these days, especially Georgia. So thanks for being involved. I was late because we were campaigning door to door, which isn't easy with COVID especially, but so I don't know if it's a good thing or bad thing that people really don't. People still come out. Is it still a good thing or bad thing overall? Why the election is important? If we remember last elections, a couple of elections which have served as milestones for Georgian political history, those elections have set a very high threshold and I mean elections of October 2012, then probably 2004 earlier. These elections were, so after 8 years of government by one party, the expectations were usually very high, and then there was a transformation and change. Problem this year is that, and the difference this year is that the expectations about change are not as high. There will be change in content and also composition of parliament, but it seems that not too many people, and polls, especially also by NDI and IRI, kind of confirm, if we can trust them, that the ruling party will remain in power, although it will not get absolute majority or constitutional majority, and might have a problem of forming the government on its own. The only reason, I would say, the only reason why there is this support for government is COVID. If we look at the public attitudes in February, this is the country where coronavirus and the threat of coronavirus has seriously impacted political climate compared to other countries. In the sense that people have, people that have been disenfranchised who had been disengaged from the ruling party, as it was expected in the time of crisis, they kind of moved closer to the ruling party, where the prime minister emerged as a leader, let's say, as a de facto leader who displays a sense of responsibility, as opposed to the billionaire that actually ran the country and probably runs the country right now behind the scenes, but in parallel to Bidzina Ivanishvili. So what we can expect is, for the very first time, coalition government of some kind. Either way, even if we think that these polls are not true, and maybe they're skewed because in general in post-Soviet countries, people are not that open to giving honest answers to pollsters of any kind, right? We know that there isn't either a party, an opposition party, one party that can win all the opposition votes, and there isn't a one charismatic leader that can do that, as opposed to, in contrast to all other previous elections, transformative elections. So either way, we will have most probably coalition government on one front or another. And that's a totally new chapter for Georgian history. Lincoln, we can't hear you, I think.
I want to go on to the second question. I want to just pick up on a couple of themes raised by the two Michael and Anna. And the second question is, how will this election impact Georgia's regime development? But before we get to that, there's a couple things that struck me. We have heard before that, well, first I want to say this. Georgia's not the only country where COVID is, changing politics, right? Mike Pence told us last night that because of how wonderfully Donald Trump has handled the COVID crisis, that the ticket's going to get reelected. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but clearly COVID is changing politics in a lot of countries. What strikes me is there is the danger in Georgia of kind of exacerbating an existing problem, which is that the Georgian Dream's support among the people is here, but because of an election-related crisis, whether COVID or Misha or something like that, they get about this many votes, and that translates into this many seats. And it creates a real disconnect between the seats that they have and the support that they actually have among the people. Now, what Anna told us is that's less likely to happen this time. So we'll see, right? We have to wait till the votes are cast, and we have to hope the election goes fairly. So we'll see what happens. But that potential for coalition government is a very important step in regime development, clearly. But also, you said something else. This is not being presented as the most important Georgian election ever, and that's a good sign. It just seems to me like it's sometimes you have to have Eisenhower running against Stevenson. You can have, or Dole running against Clinton. You can have Trump versus. We don't want to do that again. But you can have, McGovern versus Nixon every now and then, or Reagan versus anybody. But you can't have it. But the country can't take it every 4 years. So is that? I see that just on face value as a positive. But the next question, again, you go wherever you want with this, is how will this election impact Georgia's regime development? And again, I would like the panelists to stick to 3 minutes. And Alex, I'll begin with you.
Okay. I mean, so the question about regime development, I mean, those are very interesting points. And I think back in ancient times, but people used to have this expectation of transition. So, all these countries in the former Soviet Union were transitioning from sort of authoritarianism to democracy, and there were sort of hybrid regimes in the middle. And the idea and the expectation was, as these countries became more democratic, they would become more resemble Western European, North American sort of party systems, and less the sort of party of power model of politics. I think what this election kind of shows us, because the third election in a row we're going to see with GD versus UNM, Misha, the kind of durability of that sort of party of power model in Georgian elections, at least, even when there is a move towards democratization. So UNM is quite unique in the region, actually, if you think about it. It's a party of power that's not in power. And that's not really happened anywhere else in the region before. Who cares about the Republican Party of Armenia, or our Ukraine, or Akjol in Kyrgyzstan? All the former ruling parties, the former sort of parties of power, the big tent, non-ideological parties of power of the former Soviet Union. Once they lose power, they disappear or become bit players. UNM is different, and partially because Georgia is further along the democratization road. Although I hate the kind of transition mindset, but we'll use that for this point. The UNM actually retained enough support at the time of it losing government back in 2012 to actually maintain itself as a political force. And that's kind of interesting. And that tells us that the model, a sort of party of power, ex-Soviet Union model, doesn't necessarily disappear when you get more democratization. What you do get is perhaps two parties of power, or putative, or parties of ex-power continuing. And in the case of Georgia, that's actually a weakness, in that the UNM is strong enough, has enough support to kind of maintain that solid second place, but is too weak because of the historical baggage to win. So we have this, as Lincoln mentioned, this kind of continual Clinton versus Dole situation, and it will take a kind of very strong third party candidate to break through that, which we haven't had yet. So in terms of regime development, I think it tells us something about maybe not just Georgia, maybe the whole region, but actually, for once and for all, maybe we kind of kill off this idea of transition, and the region becoming more democratic equals becoming more like Western Europe and North America. If anything, those places are becoming more like Georgia. So I think that's an interesting perspective. And yeah, I mean, I wanted to pick up quickly on the sort of coalition point. I mentioned before, I don't think necessarily, even if GD doesn't win a majority, that means coalition in the kind of Western European sense. Historically, we see in Georgian elections, when a party doesn't have enough to win, they can co-opt, buy off, depending on how diplomatic you want to be, lower level people from other parties individually, and kind of cobble together a sort of ruling plurality or majority. So that's another option. Just because they lose majority doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to have a formal Western European style coalition government. I would love that to happen, but I think GD would have to fall quite a lot short of a majority for that to be the reality. Yeah, I have to shut up. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I didn't mean to be so rude, but I love my new mask. I did forget a couple of important things. I want to get back to some of the comments. You made some, I thought, a very important point. But if you have questions, you don't have to wait to the end. Throw them in the Q&A now, and we will get to them in a few minutes. So if anyone in the audience, you have a question, don't feel you have to wait. If you're watching on YouTube, you can do it in the YouTube chat, and the team at Harriman will communicate that to us. And if you want to just chat in the regular chat, that's all there. So please, we want this to be participatory, and I apologize for not making that clear. Alex, I really like this point that what we have in Georgia is a competitive party of power system, and that's unusual, and raises all kinds of questions about regime development, which Michael is now going to answer in 3 minutes.
Well, in terms of regime development, one thing I'd like to pick up on that has been said a few times here is the idea of coalition governance. And I agree with Aleko that it's not a foregone conclusion that a coalition government will look like a sort of multi-party balance of power, mutual bargaining policy, exchanges type of thing that we might associate with other parliamentary systems in Western Europe. But all that said, I think that there is certainly a chance that you're going to have a situation where the ruling party, whichever it is, or at least the largest party in parliament, and I think for a lot of people that's presumably Georgian Dream, will be in some ways politically constrained. And for me, that raises an interesting question about what that looks like, certainly in terms of governance, and certainly in terms of party development, but also regime development and the country's democratic development. I can see at least a couple ways where it could go. I mean, I think the broad idea in this sort of coalition government scenario is that, well, if there are these competing interests, that the largest party has to make certain accommodations and has to maybe moderate some of its more extreme positions in order to expand its viability within parliament and among the electorate as a whole. But in this particular case, you can also see an alternative scenario where the ruling party or the largest party actually doubles down on its own core beliefs. I don't want to say principles, I want to say beliefs, whatever they may be, positive or negative. And maybe even a scenario in which there's greater tendency towards cajoling or using extra political or non-political methods of maintaining power or forcing certain support or something of that nature. And I think in Georgia's political environment, it's not hard for a lot of people to think about a scenario in which that's the case, whatever the party may be that's forming a coalition, where instead of moderating themselves, they decide, well, we don't want to moderate ourselves. Instead, we're going to change the rules, or we're going to buy some people off, or we're going to to put pressure on this person or that person. And by no means am I saying that that's an eventuality that I expect in Georgia. And I do think that in Georgia there's a pretty strong domestic consensus and domestic demand for at least relatively democratic governance. So I don't think that even if a party went in that direction, it's not a foregone conclusion that it would succeed or that wouldn't be punished in some ways. But it's not outside the realm of possibility, and it's something that, frankly, Western countries are grappling with. To also, hit on something that Alex said. I mean, that the idea that there are parties in the West that, instead of taking their minoritarian position into account and okay, all right, I'll stop there. It's probably best to stop there anyway.
I didn't mean to cut you off, but I want to get to that because we can get to that more in the Q&A. But what really struck me about what Mike is talking about, and maybe it's a way to think about this, is that Alex says, this kind of road to democracy paradigm where everything, it's like you're in an auto shop. They made a wrong turn, that's in reverse now, it's going forward, it's accelerating, and you feel like you're at the Indy 500 or something. It doesn't work anymore, or never work. But what's striking about what Michael was saying is that maybe we should think about the regime bandwidth in which Georgia exists. What is it vacillating between? Because what you're talking about is moving, which is to me a very important question in Georgia, the varying between semi-democratic and semi-authoritarian, and the kind of extra electoral means you're talking about fit the latter more than the former. So that if I'm totally wrong about that, I want you to respond at some point. But for now, Anna, let's hear your thoughts about how this will impact Georgia's regime development.
Yes, I think this coalition government really won't be what we think from the Western countries. It will be also because Georgian politics is not around issues. If it was, you form coalitions and coalitions break up based on issues mostly. And as we know, Georgian political parties, most of them are, that's why also people move from one to another, political party platforms, they're not strongly formed around issues. No. So so coalition will be more, I'm worried that coalitions will be, again, more kind of kleptocratic. Whatever party will join, if Georgian Dream or UNM, either way, I can't see how this will be around sort of strong, passionate issue-related kind of discourse, and this is around which coalitions will form, or political strong ideological platform. What I think is, so far, Georgian Dream will ride on this wave until the economic, until the serious picture of economic impact of COVID turns up, which everybody expects to be end of the year. People are, I mean, they're poor, but so far it seems that they're not desperate to be angry, right? So I think a couple of months, and that's why Georgian government now started in this case in relation to David Gareji, this monastery complex, which is bordering, around which there is a dispute between Georgia and Azerbaijan. It's a strategic move to divert attention from economic problems, and which are reflected in two things, the fluctuating currency rate, and plus also quite a high rate of COVID-infected people. Especially compared to spring. So I think this bargaining and kind of relatively light political climate will last until the economic climate is really becomes really dark. And this usually happens here in winter, when people also have to pay electricity and gas bills. And so we will have to see some change in January, February.
Thank you, Anna. And this, there's a couple points here that are very important. One is the party could get reelected on the tail end of a wave of them doing well, coming into a trough. And then what happens, right? This is, getting reelected twice is an accomplishment in Georgia. And serving another full term would be an even bigger one. And we'll have to see. Laura, how will this election impact Georgian regime development?
Yeah. So first of all, Anna, I love the economic point that you were making there at the end. And I think that can't be sort of stated enough as far as what we're going to see coming out of, in the next period of in Georgia. I also just wanted to pick up on one other point that both Anna and Mike made around the first question around COVID, but also stability or instability in the world and what that does to electoral choices, which I think I just want to highlight, it does have an impact on potentially what we're going to see coming forward here in parliamentary elections. And then the question around being politically constrained that Mike brought up, I also wanted to maybe come up with a third option, which is sort of a feckless non-action option that I can see, okay, a consolidation in order to maintain more power. But thus far, we've seen a lot of, yes, in some areas, a tendency towards, to Lincoln's point, semi-authoritarianism as opposed to semi-democracies. When we see that, we see it in certain areas, but we've also seen sort of a lack of action, a lack of movement. So I have a hard time with this question, and I didn't like it from the beginning because I don't know what the parliament's going to look like. So I'm very practical and tactical. So it's hard for me to sort of see how this, might move forward. But let's just see if I have anything else I wanted to point out about that. We could also make a positive argument, which is this a coalition government, more increased forced political cooperation, which better reflects the will of the voters, which is, to Anna's point, and there was a great CRRC article about how Georgians aren't actually politicized on platforms. They're actually pretty much unified that the economy is terrible and that's what we need to work on, and poverty is important, something we need to improve. So an optimistic view might be that there is more cooperation, there is more focus on actual platforms and action, which is caused by a coalition government parliament. So.
And it's hard to do that in an environment where there's agreement on the issues, right? You don't argue about platforms on this, you argue about performance, right?
Yeah.
But that's the challenge. So for our last question here, I'm going to actually fold in a question from the chat, and I'll give you 4 minutes so you can address both. The last question is this, and this is, I think it's a little bit cynical, but it has to be addressed. Is this just another fight between Bidzina and Misha, right? Is this just another fight that we've had over and over for many years? But there's a question from the chat from, I believe, Michael Cole, and it says, what do the panelists think the prospects are for far-right parties? I'm reading this for the people who don't see it, can read it. Like the Alliance of Patriots and the Georgian March to win seats in this election. And what might that mean for Georgia's future political and social direction? So we're going to answer that live here as part of this question, because this is another dynamic for this election, which we haven't explored, but it is related to, because if this is a big factor, then this is not just another fight between Misha and BI. But I'd like you to take it as kind of a two-part and take 4 minutes, which is a little longer, and the order will go Michael, Anna, Laura, Alex. So Michael, please let us know your thoughts.
Sure. So to take the first question you posed, Lincoln, and I can actually blend it with the question that's been brought up by the audience. It does seem like it is a fight between BI and Misha, right? But at least from where I sit, it doesn't seem to have the same kind of salience that it did in the last parliamentary election, or even other previous elections, where that notion of Misha back for another round and BI casting himself as kind of the shield against Misha's perceived predations. It's just not the same. It's not the same kind of compelling narrative that maybe it was in the past, and you can chalk that up to the passage of time, or the fact that there seems to be greater political competition, within the Georgian political arena, or all of the above, or the salience of more pressing issues like COVID or economic development, or and I think there's also a little bit about the reforms, the political reforms that have also played a role here, in which we have a situation where, well, there's two things going on, where the threshold being lower means there's more of a chance for other parties to enter parliament, and therefore more parties and more figures are contesting the elections. And then also, it seems to be that because of that, there's a greater sense of an attempt by parties, and I would put you, Anna, in this category, by parties and political entrepreneurs to try to claim that third way, to say that, okay, yeah, like, we get it, Misha was bad, and we get it, BI is not the type of leader we want in the country, so let's present something different. Let's present an alternative to this dichotomy. And I think Anna is certainly one of the folks who's doing yeoman work trying to contest that, but there seems to be a number of others who have tried to position themselves in that space. And so in that respect, I think it certainly makes the proposition a little bit different politically. As for the Alliance of Patriots, Georgian March, Burjanadze's groupings, others like that, far right parties, certainly that's something that a seasoned Georgian observer would be broadly concerned about, and particularly with the lower threshold for parliament, you expect that they're going to be in parliament and maybe have some more impetus within parliament. And that's, I think, concerning from kind of a top level view of it. You certainly don't want these type of parties to be agenda setting or shifting the goalposts within the country. But at the same time, you can also see a scenario in which those parties, by separating themselves out, they're actually drawing far right figures away from, say, Georgian Dream, who maybe otherwise would be voting within that party or operating within that party. So it's hard to say if it's actually going to result in a much different political dynamic. And I think there's also a certain sense that when it comes to Georgian politics, there's there's going to be a constituency for these types of votes. I don't think that goes away. I don't think that changes. I don't think that's new, and I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. But you know, I'm not sure that means that they're going to be suddenly, you know, vaunting themselves to the precipice of political power. What might be possible is that in a coalition environment that they could negotiate themselves closer to the coalition building party. But I think that I'm really more of in a wait and see mode for that.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to turn to Anna in a second, but I just want to raise this point about the far right parties, because you hit the nail on the head. If there's a constituency for it, then the idea of a parliamentary system is not just to get the voices that Western liberals like, but to get all voices represented. And I'm also wondering, on a practical level, to paraphrase President Lyndon Johnson, is it better to have them inside the tent looking out than outside the tent looking in, the tent being parliament? So that's always a question. But Anna, you don't have to answer that question, but the broader question, will this be just another fight between BI and Misha? And then what about these far right groups? And 4 minutes.
Yes. Well, first of all, they are not forces to be counted for in any way in Georgian politics based on 2 reasons. One is because they're not growing. I mean, look at the Alliance of Patriots. They emerged with very high expectations, kind of building up in the beginning in local elections first. And then since then, they're not growing in terms of human resources. They have trouble attracting new people. They don't have new faces. It's same 2 people that run everything. So, and in terms of constituency, also, they're not growing in polls. I think it's also a problematic tendency overall. I don't know if it's because of ruling party that all these kind of newly emerged parties, they're not growing beyond a particular threshold. So Vashadze, 2%, 3%, Aleko, we will see how he performs this year. I think that's a problem. So that's a problem. So everybody has a sort of, most people have this hopeful start, including Patriots. People thought they were scary. But first of all, because of that, they're not growing in any sense, constituency, percentage, polls, or human resources. And second, they were inside the parliament in the last round. And look, what happened? Nothing. Sometimes they make loud statements. Okay, that's it. I mean, nothing, right? So they're not in any way, I think they're not dangerous for kind of democracy, liberal democracy in Georgia. And Bidzina and Misha, well, they're more gatekeepers. I think they've changed the roles. So I think Misha was an outgoing leader and then kind of a threat. Based on that, BI capitalized, and then he occupied the role of a leader. Now they're gatekeepers. I mean, the only thing they're doing right now is not letting anybody else emerge by passing the ball to each other. That's it. When somebody figures out, like me, how to break through this, that's the end of this game. So far, it's with this, the problem is not just the resource in terms of money, it's discourse, right? TV stations, and then passing this ball in terms of media discourse all the time to each other. So this is like trying to insert your head in this heated wave going back and forth. So right now their role is this. I think they're both very content with this role. Both have capitalized. I don't see why Misha would want to return to Georgia right now based on his career path in Ukraine. So the only thing they're doing is or maybe he would want to come back. Why, we don't know. Or maybe he would want to go to Belarus as a prime minister next. Yeah, why not? So that's their role right now. Is they're spoiling the development of this country.
Okay, I think that what strikes me about your description of Bidzina and Misha is that Misha, this is not the first more powerful figure with whom Misha has crafted a dysfunctional relationship and a codependent relationship to keep him relevant, right? It's really striking. That's a very kind of striking politico-psychological dynamic. Laura, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, okay, so to Anna and Mike's point about Alliance of Patriots, far-right groups, I couldn't agree more. It's a constituency, but it's also not only is not growing, I would say it's probably shrinking. I don't think the youth of Georgia are like looking, for the far right as their future. So I think that it's not something to be, obviously it needs to be watched and paid attention to, but not overly concerning going forward. On Ivanishvili and Saakashvili, so couple of thoughts. I wanted to look a little bit on campaigning, and Anna can correct me here if I'm wrong, but it does seem that the Georgian Dream approach has been to try to not really talk about Misha in the same way that they have in the past. And I think that may be because they were criticized for 8 years of only ever talking about the UNM and not having sort of a policy, vision future for it going forward. So it does seem that they're trying to make somewhat of a pivot to sort of ignore Saakashvili or not maybe talk about that piece as much and be a little bit more positive. Whereas the UNM side, it's all Misha all the time. So, and that may also play into the power dynamic between the two parties. The other thing I just wanted to point out, and I think several panelists have touched on this, is within the opposition coalition itself, and to Anna's point, had there not been a Saakashvili sort of factor, who would emerge as a leader would be very different. And the way in which the coalitions would function together would be very different. And you would have a much greater diversity of voices. With Saakashvili being in the mix, some coalition parties are like, hey, no, there's red lines here. And other ones are sort of overshadowed by, his loyalists and his sort of, I can get you the whatever percentage of the vote he can get every time. That hasn't really changed in the last sort of piece. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that as something to pay attention to. And then the piece on this sort of third way, which Anna is representing, and there are other parties as well. I think this is really a space to watch going forward. I think this is where the youth vote is interested. I think they're tired of this dynamic between these, to Alex's point, two power parties that we keep hearing about. It's tiring. Want something going forward, and I don't know why that optimistic start that we sort of see with some of the smaller parties keeps fizzling, but it will be interesting to see what kind of votes they get, and I do think there's an opportunity in the third way. So thanks.
Alex, before we get, I just want to, one thing Laura said, that sometimes time goes by much faster than you think or than you might like, but it is worth noting, we talk about the youth vote, that the last time the United National Movement won an election was 2008. That means if you're under 30, you've never voted, had a chance to vote in an election once they won. Think of the politicians, in 2008, people thought that Bill Richardson had a real chance of becoming president, right? In 2008, Joe Biden was, okay, bad example, but you understand, it's a long time. And so for the youth, this is an even longer time than it is for those of us who are well into middle age. Okay, on that cheery note, Alex, we'll wrap up this section, although Michael's going to have 30 seconds at the end to just add on one quick comment. But Alex, what are your thoughts on these questions?
Yeah, okay. I'll start with the far right because that's the easier question. I was nodding along to what Anna was saying. I think we can really over-egg the far right threat. I'm sitting here in the Netherlands where sort of two far right parties have sort of teens in the level of support. It's a far worse threat in the West than it is in Georgia at the moment. We've got to remember, the Alliance of Patriots have their own TV channel. Imagine if the far right had their own TV channel in the Netherlands or UK or the US. I suppose they sort of do in the US. Okay, I'll stop there. but they have a lot of resources in terms of, they can communicate, they have their TV channel, and yet they're stuck on sort of 3 to 5% of the vote. That tells you they're not a big threat electorally. But there's one sense in which they may be more relevant in this parliament, and that if GD does not get the majority, and as I said, I don't expect it to be a kind of classical European style programmatic kind of coalition, but the Alliance of Patriots, ultimately, if you give them a choice between Misha and GD, they and their Russian patrons both prefer GD. And I'm not one of these GD is a crypto pro-Russian force people at all. But you give Alliance of Patriots that choice, I think it's clear which way they're going. I think in that kind of situation, maybe they become more relevant. And it would be a bad thing because they will only push DD in the wrong direction. But other than that, I think electorally, we would love it in the West to have far right on 3 to 5% of the vote, really. That doesn't mean, I don't think there's a kind of demand for that kind of party, which may be above that level, but I don't think that's the threat. As for the main question, about is this BI versus Misha again? Well, obviously, yes, on one level. And I think we need to think about why. And there are both supply side and demand side reasons for why we're in this position. We've talked a lot about the demand side, and that like Misha is he's got too much of a loyal supporter base to fail, and he's not ever going to kind of be popular enough to win because of all his baggage, you know. But there's also a sort of supply side, and I think that's what Anna was kind of getting at. There's a lot of politicians out there. There's a big marketplace, and all of them have sort of 3-5% of the vote. There's not been this sort of third party kind of obvious candidate that will break through. And I think last election, we almost had more of that than this time. We had Artur Buthelezi, who briefly looked like he might be that. Obviously fell apart before the election, but it looked more like that could be, and it shows that there is a demand for that kind of third force, but just didn't work out. Whereas I think this time it's not going to come together. So back to the point I started with actually at the beginning, this parliament might actually be the kind of nursery for these new political figures. And, you know, Anna might be that in 4 years' time, you know, it could be anyone else. And, you know, this much more plural parliament, this parliament that becomes the actual arena of Georgian political life again, rather than sort of a curated subset of that arena, could be an opportunity for, in 4 years' time, that third force to arise. And I don't know who it will be. I don't know whether it will happen or not, but I think there is an opportunity there for these political parties because of the electoral reform, because more of them are going to get into this parliament, for them to become that sort of third force. And thankfully, I don't think that third force is going to be the Alliance of Patriots, because they had an opportunity to do that. They were the only non-GD UNM party in parliament, and they're popular, actually less popular than they were last time. So I'm hopeful on that front. But I think that sort of third party demand is there. But to kind of push through that kind of inertia, the sort of place we are at the moment, there needs to be sort of a leader that becomes, you know, the kind of linchpin around this third force. I don't think it's going to happen now, but I think in the next 4 years it will likely happen.
Thank you. And for me, the biggest barrier to the third party is this perception that it's between BI and Misha, because that forces everybody because of fear back into their corners, and those corners grow. We have we're going to move to the kind of Q&A phase of this, and you know, I don't need each panelist to just answer the question if they feel they have something, you know, compelling to say. Try to keep your remarks brief so we can get there. We have 3 questions so far. I'd like to get to all 3 of them. I'm going to read the first one as we go because not everyone can see them. This is from Cameron Hallen. Given GD's previous campaign saturation in the villages in 2018 and before, I'm wondering what the panelists' thoughts are regarding Georgian Dream's expected loss of unilateral power being an effect of relative losses in on-the-ground mobilization compared to UNM and other parties due to COVID and independent of constitutional changes. So whoever wants to take a crack at that, take a crack. And kind of raise your hand if you're one of the panelists who just start talking. Okay. If you want to talk, you should unmute yourself. That'd be the first step. And if not, we can move on. We don't have to answer it, but we can move on. Why don't we move on to the second question?
I can quickly take a stab at this. I actually think that I'd be interested to hear what Anna has to say about this. I don't feel super qualified to really speculate completely on the role of COVID or like village level mobilization, but because I mean, honestly, I haven't seen that much data on it, so I'm really would only be responding from my gut. But if I am going to respond from my gut, I think that I'm sure that's probably a role on the margins in terms of mobilization and getting voters out. But I would say it's to go back to a point that Lincoln made quite a bit earlier. This idea of regime cycles. We're actually kind of heading into like the home stretch of the Georgian Dream's regime cycle. If we're taking it as like kind of a 9 to 13 year type of cycle, as we've seen in the past governments. And so, you know, the fact that we are in that kind of that latter stage of the regime cycle, you know, not saying it's necessarily a immutable rule or anything, but I think there is generally a sense that, well, maybe Georgian Dream's time is nearing its end, or at least, Georgian Dream as it was voted for in 2012 is maybe not kind of nearing the end of that natural cycle in Georgian politics. That doesn't, mean that Georgian Dream couldn't last on beyond, this election and the next. But I think there is a sense that Georgian Dream, as it's been, as it was formed in 2011, won power in 2012, and has governed since then, maybe it's time for something a little bit different, whether, from Georgian Dream or someone else. So I think, there's probably some mobilization aspects that are important. There are some constitutional, the threshold, parliamentary threshold and politicking type of elements that are important. And I think in aggregate, these things are important, but in marginal degrees. So that's my stab at an answer. And Anna, I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that. You probably have a better sense of it than any of us do.
Anna, do you want to unmute?
Just to say shortly, I think Georgian Dream is just form. I mean, it's a party in form, devoid of all contents. I mean, it had ideological content, restoration of justice or whatever, truth and reconciliation, justice, with which it came to power, 2012, and then second round, right? Now it's just, even look at their slogan. The parties for this election, their slogan is, so they don't have a song anymore, even because probably they couldn't find anyone who could be inspired to write a song. In 2016, they had a song, but this time they don't even have a party song to mobilize. And the slogan is "United for Georgia's Success." I mean, nothing. And to respond to Laura's point, Bidzina spent 40 minutes of his election speech, party presentation speech, speaking about UNM. So their only content of GD is not letting UNM to come back. Right? In terms of regional mobilization, I think it's more kleptocracy. So promising, but today I was campaigning, most people that work or have somebody that works in government offices, they don't want to even appear in photos, right? So it's mostly going to be either bargaining for jobs or threatening that they will lose jobs, or maybe more petty bribery, like small favors in regions. But that's how they're going to go. So I think the problem is that nobody can win. It's not that GD can't lose, but it's that there's nobody there ready who can win these elections.
Alex or Laura, do you want to? I can't. Okay, we're gonna move on to question 2 here, which is, I think this is from Nick Bejant. I'm not sure how to pronounce the last name. What do the panelists think regarding the impact of external actors on the election, states or otherwise? Has there been any noticeable shift in the discourse around Georgia and the EU, NATO, US, Russia, and/or China? Or has there simply been little oxygen for such issues in this election, given COVID's seeming eternal flame? So that seems like a very good question. Does anyone want to take a crack at addressing it?
I'll have a go if you want. It's a very boring answer, I'm afraid, and basically more or less no. I mean, like we're sitting through a time where we have pretty much a full-blown hot war going on in Nagorno-Karabakh, and it's barely registering in kind of the media in a lot of the West. And the EU and the US have been very lukewarm and very sort of apathetic and sort of slow to act on that. And that's something a lot more serious than the Georgian election. So I think the main thing in terms of the external sort of interest in this election is it going to be a clean election-ish? And I mean ish there, because like if there's a big kind of Kyrgyzstan style scandal, then I think people will take notice. If it's more or less sort of like 2016 or even like 2012 actually, it'll be interesting, but I don't think the EU, the US, or any of these other external parties are going to revolutionize their stance towards Georgia. And actually, foreign policy is quite a consensus subject in Georgian politics still. You know, the UN and GD both broadly pay lip service to the same sort of foreign policy goals. And I really don't think, you know, I think that the priority for external actors is basically stability, don't make a mess of it, don't rig it egregiously. And, you know, if we have a reasonably clean election, or even a sort of, you know, just about passes the grade kind of election, I think they'll be happy with that. That's a really boring answer, I know, but I think it's probably the right one.
Anybody want to add anything to that? Michael.
So, I pretty much agree with everything that Alex just said. I would only add though that I think there is an exogenous variable when you think about Georgian political development as a whole, in a couple of ways. And one, and actually I meant to say this in response to one of the earlier questions, we're not talking about the far right in Georgia all that much now, and there are a lot of good reasons for that. But I think one of the reasons, and something that isn't as maybe as not as often raised anymore, is that the perception was a few years ago, particularly surrounding Nino Borjanadze's political fortunes, the perception was that she would receive these mass injections of funding at the home stretch of the campaign cycle, which would basically inflate her numbers. And she was, you know, there were a couple elections she was getting something like 10% in the final tally, and this was largely attributed to these injections of funding, and the dangling implication being that it was from Russia. In the last few years, that hasn't transpired in the same way, and I think the idea is that, well, Russia just doesn't have that. It doesn't see the need for doing that sort of thing. Maybe they don't think these parties are viable. Maybe they don't think the money is all that well spent, or maybe they have bigger fish to fry where to spend their money, right? And I think, you know, that's kind of an important consideration when we think about not just the fortunes of far right parties, but Georgia in general. We're just not seeing that kind of spend where, you know, Russia is not focusing its disinformation and influence operations so squarely on Georgia as we were seeing in like kind of the 2013 to 2015-16 period, where Georgia was kind of a laboratory for a lot of things that we started to see elsewhere in Europe and North America from Russia. So I think that's important to note. And I think another thing to mention too is that in terms of foreign policy, and I agree with Alex that stability is kind of a keystone here, but you know, going back to Karabakh, where we have what is breaking out to a full-blown war, and what is increasingly a regional conflagration, this sort of you know, muddling through approach from previous governments, and I'd say, you know, not just Georgian Dream. I think this is kind of a Georgian. This has been part of Georgian foreign policy for a while. That, well, you know, we are normatively, you know, neutral, friendly to Azerbaijan, but there's kind of greater civilizational, if you could say, affinity for Armenia. And it's kind of put Georgia in this very strange place where you have the outbreak of war, and there's this larger question of how Georgia is going to navigate it. I don't think there's a lot of interest really right now in sort of unpacking that and really thinking about, you know, what the implications are of Georgian foreign policy in those things, but maybe there should be. And I think as this war continues to drag on and as it becomes more evident for Georgians, I think that may become a larger question. And the last thing I'll say very quickly is that I don't think you can separate political development from Euro-Atlantic conditionality. And I think there is a general sense that there really isn't that much left for Georgia to do other than gain membership to NATO and the EU. And that doesn't seem to be in the offing in the near to medium term. And so I think from the regime perspective, it's kind of like, well, you know, what do we need to do? Or maybe the regime perspective is that there's nothing that needs to be done. But that's certainly, I think, a consideration moving forward.
Does anyone have any other comments on this question? I want to just raise a couple things. One, there's a lot going on in the world besides COVID. And there is always a tendency in Georgia, almost an article of faith among the Georgian people, to overstate Georgia's importance to the rest of the world, right? So if you're sitting in, so there's the conflict between the two other countries in the South Caucasus. Georgia has the good distinction of not being at war relative to these countries. If you're Vladimir Putin, you have two clients who are in danger of being ousted from power by democratic movements, right? One in Minsk and one in Washington. And that's taking up a lot of his attention as well. And the West, experiencing its own challenges and its own democratic rollback in the United States, is not in the position that it has been over most of this century in the 90s. I mean, I have read some of the election reports from American organizations and Western organizations, which are generally very high quality. I'm not criticizing that, nor am I criticizing the people who write the reports, do the research, do the observation. But I know how that lands in the Georgian Dream government right now, right? And not because I chat with these folks, but I've chatted with them in the past. And the U.S., until we recognize and wrestle with our own democratic rollback, the rest of the world, the smarter people in the rest of the world, they may want to work with us. They may benefit from working with us, but they're not going to take that part of it very seriously. And that crisis in the West spills over. We have two more questions, and I want to get through them quickly. So we're going to do this kind of lightning round style, and then we're going to have some brief comments on Nagorno-Karabakh. So this is from legendary Georgian American civil society and other activist, Khatuna Khvichia, and she says, at the end, elections are about choice among those presented on the ballot. Two parties will get the first most seats, the GD and the UNM. Could the panelists, and this is a softball, not really at all, could the panelists comment on which party will be better for Georgia's democratic and economic development to get more votes in the 2 weeks, the Georgian Dream or the UNM? So I think what Khatuna is saying is, if you were voting in this election, who would you vote for? I'll go first and say I'm voting for Joe Biden. Does anybody want to answer this question?
I'm voting for Anna Dolidze.
Oh, I was going to say that. That was my thing.
I don't fight in Georgia, but if things go poorly over the next 3 months here, I might be voting in the next Georgian election.
Yeah, I mean,
Lincoln, I have offered my recommendation for Georgian citizenship so many times to you.
I know, I was discussing it with my wife. We'll get back to you in how things go.
In December.
When Anna ascends to the throne, we'll all be submitting our application.
Okay, should we move on? I'm taking that's a soft path.
I think unless Didu Bachurati is expanded to include The Hague in past constituency, I'm unable to vote for Anna, unfortunately. So that's as far as I'll go.
So Khatuna, it looks like you're going to have to make up your own mind on that one, but we can talk about that offline. So this is from the last question from the audience, and then we're going to do a quick round of Nagorno-Karabakh in Georgia. So this is from Jay. I don't know what the J stands for. Freer via YouTube. This is a good question. Global news is so rarely discussed on the U.S. Main Street. How might you describe why it is in the interest of non-academics, in other words, lay people in the U.S., to keep up to date regarding the election outcome? Let's keep comments to 20, 30 seconds. And who wants to take that one?
Can you rephrase that for a second? I couldn't follow.
Why should lay people in the United States who aren't specialists care about what happens in this Georgian election? That's how I'm going to rephrase it. Who wants to take a crack at that?
I'll say I'm not sure they need to, honestly. I mean, I'm all for people to learn as much about the world as possible, but I think right now the U.S. has to kind of make sure its own house is in order. I think it's important to know what's going on in foreign countries, and certainly what's going on in countries that adjoin places of great strategic import, as Karabakh seems to be telling us. But in terms of getting into the weeds on like kind of the coalition push and pull in the Georgian parliament, the latest political law, the latest reforms or what have you, I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. And frankly, I in the same way, I wouldn't feel as though a Georgian should feel that they had to get really in depth on Virginia state politics where I live. I'll just leave it there.
Okay, anybody else? I'll say this. I mean, the reason that the layperson should care is these things aren't important until they are, right? Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. Everyone on this panel was, of course, very aware of that. I assume all of the people in the audience were. That almost became a major global conflict, right? There were people in Moscow, Tbilisi, and Washington who wanted it to, right? That's hard to disaggregate from the previous election and the coming election that was coming in Georgia at that time. So that's why this is important. This stuff isn't ever important until it is. So you don't have to pay a lot of attention, but it's good to pay a little bit of attention. So let's do a quick round on Georgia and Nagorno-Karabakh, and let's go Michael, Laura, Alex, and Anna. So like 30 to 40 seconds each.
What am I saying?
Georgia, why is Nagorno-Karabakh, like this is happening right next to Georgia?
Yeah.
How does this have bearing on Georgia?
Yeah, I mean, it has every bearing on Georgia. I mean, Georgia is basically an impossible position. As I said earlier, for a lot of reasons, Georgia is kind of normatively, leans towards Azerbaijan and Turkey for that matter in certain respects. And that in Azerbaijan, they see a cognate in Karabakh to their own separatist issues in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, where their population was ethnically cleansed and displaced. And from that perspective, they can't countenance a solution in Karabakh where actions like that are essentially rewarded. But at the same time, there's probably a great deal more, I would say retail affinity for Armenia, in the sense that Armenia is probably is seen probably by a greater percentage of the population as having a kind of a comparable narrative to Georgia as sort of a civilizational fraternal twin. Each of them, one of them had Christianity first. One of them had made wine first. One of them fought off the foreign invaders better or didn't at various points in time. So there is that kind of linkage. But in terms of like strategically, what is very difficult is that if this does, not only do they have to negotiate that rocky terrain between the two warring parties with which they have good relations on both sides and have significant minority populations within their country. But if it becomes a more regional conflagration, there are concerns that Russia and Armenia will demand a land and air corridor to resupply Armenia, and Georgia would either have to say yes and therefore become a party to the conflict on the side of Russia, basically, or say no, and therefore become a battleground and face the possibility of invasion. So in either case, they end up being a battleground for in a war they wanted no part in. And I think that's a very scary proposition.
Okay, Laura.
Absolutely. I'm going to second Mike on that. Georgia has everything to gain by maintaining their positive relations with both Armenia and Azerbaijan, as well as with Turkey thus far. And so any sort of movement that they're forced to take puts them in a strategically worse position than they had been thus far. So it's obviously there's no good move that they can make, and there's not a lot of power they also have for providing any sort of direct negotiation to sort of help soothe the conflict, being that it's sort of part of a larger proxy situation between Russia and Turkey. So it's extremely difficult for Georgia, and it does nothing good.
Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of you, and that, yeah, I mean, historically, Georgia's sort of geopolitical pipeline kind of territorial integrity interests have been closer to the Azeris and the Armenians for obvious reasons historically. But I think if you're sitting in Tbilisi and you're in the foreign ministry, I mean, let's be honest here, the huge likelihood is that the current kind of heating up of the conflict came probably from the Azeri direction, because they had the Armenians weren't really in a position to do that right now. They'd probably be more annoyed with the Azeris than with the Armenians right now, because Georgia's primary interest right now is for there not to be a war, for all the reasons that Mike said. They don't want to be surrounded by a wall of fire. They don't want to have to be under pressure to sort of transit weapons or anything else to either of the parties. They want this war to stop. And I think this is where I want to add to that a bit, in that Georgia historically has had a kind of passive neutrality policy on Armenia and Azerbaijan. Like they sort of try and be nice to both sides, but actually ultimately don't say anything and sort of keep well back. And I completely understand why that's been the policy for so many years, and it's worked reasonably well until now. The issue is now the stakes are much higher for Georgia. And the question for the Georgian policy world, foreign policy world, is to think, well, maybe we should have a more active neutrality. In that, if you look at all of the actors in the region, Turkey, Iran, Russia, the conflict sides themselves, all of them are on one side or the other, broadly speaking. Georgia is basically the only country in the region that is a kind of a sort of genuinely sort of more or less neutral party. Obviously, they don't want, as Mike said, they don't want sort of ethnic cleansing to be rewarded, but we're not at that stage in the conflict now. We're in the middle of a hot war. And Georgia's sort of genuine interest is for this conflict to stop. So there is a case, I think, for the Georgians to have a more active policy of neutrality. So to actually try and mediate, and obviously they can't replace the kind of mechanisms that are already in place, but sort of by being from the region, from being sort of not one of the major powers, from being actually genuinely nationally interested in this stopping, I think Georgia has a lot more potential to play a positive role in mediation than it has historically. Whether Russia, Turkey, etc., allow them to do so is another question. But I think if I were sitting on Chitadze Street in the foreign ministry, I would be thinking, okay, that's trying to be more active. And I think preliminarily, I think looking at what Georgian officials have been saying, they've made some tentative steps in that direction. I think that's a good thing. So yeah, I think this might be time for Georgia to kind of review its kind of policy towards Armenia and Azerbaijan. Maybe slightly riskier, but also the current situation is incredibly risky for Georgia. And I think that changes the calculation in Tbilisi.
And Anna, last thoughts.
I absolutely agree with all the thoughts expressed. I was thinking, and I have actually proposed, Tbilisi could be, next Minsk for all this negotiation, which when it takes place between everybody in the region. Definitely, there's a potential for this, and we really, this is not by far not a good thing for Georgia's development, economy, for transit. For kind of Silk Road transit, anything. I'm worried though that how I have observed the current government's mentality usually there. So Misha's approach was, if there is a crisis, jump in to reap the benefits. BI's approach is, if there is a crisis, lie down under the radar so it passes. I think so. I don't think they will take this active neutrality. I really like the term position, but I might be wrong, because I think it would be really useful if we offered our good offices, conciliatory services, whatever, just to act as a host for the negotiation rounds that will unfold.
Okay. I think we're going to wrap this up, and I want to thank everyone on the panel. This was really a great discussion. This is one of the, I knew this was going to be a great discussion because of the people on the panel, but we really had a very substantive, and that's unusual when we talk about Georgia. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the Harriman Institute for hosting this event and for putting together the technology, which ran extremely smoothly, except for my misinforming people at points, but otherwise ran extremely smoothly. I'm going to say my mask on now. And thank you all for coming, and we'll see what happens in the Georgian election in the next few days. And thanks again to everybody.
Yeah, thank you as well.
Thank you, Lincoln. Thank you. Thank you for hosting, and to Harriman as well.